the General Assembly, the Secretary of Commerce, and the Economic Development Board on the role of science and technology in economic development. I saw Dr. Hardin talk last year at Duke, and I was really amazed at learning about how North Carolina has changed over the years in its role of science and technology, so I thought he'd be a really good speaker from here. And he's really attentive to grad students and is really willing to engage with us, so there will be a discussion period at the end where we can do questions.
All right.
So thank you, welcome.
5 years in grad school, and so I know what it's like. And how many of you, before this talk was announced, how many of you knew that there was such a thing as the Office of Science, Technology, and Innovation? It's okay if you don't know me. Okay, wow, that's actually more than I thought. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my office and science, and technology, and innovation policy in general. And Anna told me that I had 50 minutes, which is a long time to talk, but I'm probably going to use it all, and I sometimes go long, and so she's going to cut me off. Or Ryan, one of them or both of them if I go too long. So I got 40 slides. I think I can go through them pretty quickly, but we'll see. So okay, so here's what we're going to cover. I'm going to start, this is like the first day of a semester. You have to go over some definitions, so I'm going to go over some definitions to set the stage. Then I'm going to talk about North Carolina's science, technology, and innovation history. That's what STI stands for. An overview kind of how it's played out since the 1950s and some of the priorities currently. And I have values there because priorities are essentially a manifestation of a society's values. And so you'll see why I talk about that in just a minute. Then I'm going to talk about tracking innovation, which is a report that my office does every couple of years. That is a comprehensive report card of 40 different measures of innovation and research and development in science and technology across the state, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. And if you have a question when I'm talking, please feel free to stop me and ask me as well. Okay, so start with the obligatory definitions. I'm sure you all know what science is, but it's essentially knowledge, systematic knowledge and facts and truths. Those are outcomes. But it also is the result of a process. That's systematic observation and experimentation. And you all know that, but that's important because not everyone thinks like a scientist. In fact, most people don't think like a scientist, and especially politicians. And ideally, science is impersonal, objective, and value-free. Of course, we all bring our values to it, but it is hopefully more objective than most things. Politics, on the other hand, comes from the Greek word polis, and it's more of a process. Politics is a thing, but it's also more of a process. When I teach political science sometimes at UNC, we always start off with like 5 different definitions of politics, and some of them people really like, some they don't. The one that I always like, that's always kind of not intuitive for people, is this one. That politics is the authoritative allocation of values, and I'll explain that in just a minute. And so it's essentially a process. Much more personal, much more subjective, much more value-laden in science. And then policy is essentially an output, it's an outcome, and it's whatever governments choose to do or not to do. And policy is really a blend of knowledge and values, and you'll see in a minute why I say that. So if you look at the policy-making process, it's really relatively simple. It's essentially an input-output model where the inputs are people's or society's values, views, the issues that we care about. Those often lead to conflict and problems. Those hopefully get allocated or decided by institutions like the executive branch, the legislature, or the judiciary, and they get allocated into outputs that are public policy solutions. This is a very dynamic system. The values and the inputs are always changing, sometimes growing, sometimes shrinking. Now, in the state of the world that we're in, I probably couldn't represent it well because it's probably too dynamic and conflictual. But the institutions change over time, the public policy solutions change over time, but generally the values are much more active than, or changing dynamic than the institutions. I mean, we essentially have the same institutions that we had when the founders set them up, but they have changed over time. Public policy solutions generally change pretty incrementally, but there's a feedback loop. So if you ever find yourself saying, why do we have this policy or that policy? generally what you need to do, okay, that gets old. Sorry, I don't know how to stop it. At least when the bottom part shows, is either, if you don't like what you see on the back end, look to the front end or the middle part and say, well, something must be weird or strange in terms of people's values or inputs, or maybe their values and inputs are fine, but there's something screwy about the whole institutional system that we have. And often it's those things are all working together to explain what we have. So values and views. The views of scientists and the values of scientists are pretty different from the views of politicians. Now these are very big generalizations that I'm making, so these are not hard and fast. But in general, scientists like to develop theories. That's how science develops. Politicians are not as interested in theories, except maybe conspiracy theories. They tend to advocate and they follow ideologies, and they're not always well thought out. They're just kind of gut beliefs, often the people's political beliefs. Scientists are pretty skeptical of power. Politicians actually like power and they use power. I mean, politics is about making authoritative decisions. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, we're in a messy world and somebody has to make decisions for, who's going to pay who's going to get health care, and those are tough decisions. Somebody has to make those decisions. And sometimes, when you have 535 legislators in the U.S. Congress, it'd be chaos unless somebody had some power to get people in line. And so that's why we have power and committee leadership and things like that in the legislature. Scientists seek accuracy. Politicians sometimes seek accuracy, but often they seek popularity or support, whether that's accurate or not. Scientists tend to think abstractly. Politicians think a lot more practically. I've had to learn that in my job, which I'll tell you about in a minute. Most of my work doesn't involve dealing with legislators, but sometimes I do deal with legislators. And if you go in there with some sort of abstract theoretical idea, their eyes glaze over very quickly. They want to know, concrete, what do you want, how much is it going to cost, and how is this going to help my constituents? And so you got to be a lot more practical. Scientists do research, and often, if you look at a lot of journal articles, some of the times they will say, they're not always 100%, we found this exactly and we proved this. It's often the evidence suggests this, or it leads to different hypotheses. The conclusions are often tentative. Politicians rarely are tentative. They usually take a pretty firm stand on the issues they care about. Scientists offer many causes. They understand that the world is a pretty complex place. Often you can't boil it down to a single answer. Politicians don't like messy places because it's hard to assign blame, it's hard to take credit, and they like to keep things as simple as possible and offer single causes. Scientists understand that the world often moves slowly. We have long-term causes. Causes are not always instantaneous. Politicians care a lot about short-term payoff. We were just talking about that up here a minute ago. Politicians, most are elected every 2 years. And so they have to be accountable to their constituents, which is a good thing. But their constituents are going to say, well, what have you done for me in the last 2 years, or not even the last 2 years, in the last 6 months, and what are you going to do for me, 2 months from now if you get elected? And so it's hard to make a promise as a politician and say, I'm going to create something that's going to benefit people 20 years from now. Some people are going to say, well, I'd like my grandchildren to benefit, but most people are thinking about the present, and they tend to discount the future. Most scientists are planning for the next publication in France. Most politicians are planning for the next election. Scientists hopefully are seeking the good of the whole. Politicians are often seeking the good of the whole, but they tend to be more responsive to groups and interests. And that sounds negative, but that's the way they get reelected. Scientists often seek professional prestige. Politicians seek name recognition. So there's a lot of parallels, but there's also a lot of differences. The reason I talk about this is because I've been doing science policy long enough, and I've lived in the academic world and the policy world, and they often speak different languages, and the two worlds often do not understand each other, and a lot of it is because they come at it from the world from different perspectives. And that's not necessarily bad, but it is what it is. And just being aware of those things helps. Now, I didn't come up with those on my own. I should have cited the source. I don't remember what it was. I got it off the internet somewhere. But it was an authoritative source. I remember that. Sorry, I should have cited that. Okay, so what are my values and views? What are you going to get from listening to me? Well, I tend to think more like a scientist than a politician. Lots of times I'll tell people I got a PhD in political science and they'll say, oh, you want to be a politician? And I will say, absolutely not. That's the last thing I want to be. But I do kind of have a morbid fascination with politics, like how do all these decisions get made and why is it so conflictual? And so I wanted to study it academically, so that's what I did. But I wound up not being a professor. I wound up being more of a practitioner, but not as an elected official, but as a bureaucrat, a lifetime government official. But I know that politics is inevitable and you can't ignore it. So you ignore it at your peril. And so you can think like a scientist, but you also need to have your scientific hat, but you also need to have your political hat. And some of the times they conflict, but you got to have both on. So I got a BA in economics from Baylor University back in 1989. Then I came to UNC in 1990, got a PhD in 96 in political science. Also specialized in public policy. At the time, it was health policy because that was a big deal. This was the 4-year higher education institution in North Carolina. It's part of the UNC system. And the system office is located in Chapel Hill. And I worked there from 96 to 2003 in what was called their Research and Sponsored Programs Division. So I had a front row seat at all the research that was going on at all 17 institutions, and got a really good exposure to not just my discipline of political science, but all the disciplines out there. That doesn't mean I'm an expert at any of them. It just means that I have a sense now of what goes on and how they get funded and what the policies are around those. But in 2003, I kind of run my course at general administration, so I moved over, kind of a lateral move to the Department of Commerce and moved to something called the, well, now it's called the Office of Science, Technology, and Innovation, but it was called the Board of Science, Technology, and Innovation. So I'll tell you about that in just a minute. So I've been doing that ever since. Okay, so some of the times when I talk to people about science policy, I'll start telling them what I do, and they're like, well, that doesn't seem like what I think science policy is at all. And I tend to forget that because I know what I do, and it's science policy. But I tend to forget science policy is a big thing and can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And there's really kind of two ways to look at it. One of those ways is policy for science, and this is what I do in my office. And this is decision making about how to fund or structure the systematic pursuit of knowledge. So this is where these agencies, the legislature, the executive, and the judicial, influence the scientific process. And at the university level, the vast majority of the funding that goes into scientific R&D is paid for by the federal government. That percentage is a little lower here at NC State. NC State gets more from the state and more from industry than most universities, but it still gets the vast majority from the federal government. But here are the types of questions. These are just 5 or 6 questions, but these are all kind of classic questions in the realm of policy for science. And some of these are at the federal level and some are at the state level. In general, most science policy that occurs at the federal level and not the state level. In most states, there's not a lot of science policy that takes place. To the extent it takes place in North Carolina, most of it goes through my office. And it's not a lot. Most of it is actually economic development focused. But there are some agencies that do more of the second thing, which is science for policy. So this is just the reverse. The use of knowledge to assist or improve policy decision making. So this is where the scientists hopefully influence policy. And so what I've learned over time is that when I talk to most graduate students or people in academia, this is usually, I think, what they're thinking about when they think of science policy is how do we take our scientific knowledge and expertise and help politicians make better decisions? And that's an admirable goal. It's also a very difficult goal for the reasons I said earlier about living in different worlds and speaking different languages And politicians have a lot of different forces pulling on them, and academics and graduate students are just one of about 1,000 other forces pulling at them. And so that makes it tough. But those are the types of questions and many others that could be asked. So in terms of North Carolina, when I think of agencies, state agencies that do more science for policy, I would think of, for example, the Department of Environmental Quality, which deals with environmental issues and energy issues. And so a lot of the people who work at DEQ are scientists, and they have come from NC State or other universities and have PhDs and actually sometimes do lab work. DOT, the Department of Transportation, also has a decent number of scientists, more engineers than scientists. Also, the Department of Health and Human Services does. But and agriculture a little bit. So there are always some scientists in each of the agencies, but they're usually a minority of the people that work in those agencies. And the number of people in the Department of Commerce where I work that have PhDs is pretty small. It's probably 5% or less, is my guess. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about North Carolina's history. How am I doing? I've got 15 minutes in, 9 slides in. Okay, all right. So that's all right. Those were the slow slides. Okay, so when people think of North Carolina in science and technology and innovation, they tend to think that this is a pretty strong state. And that's understandable, especially if you live in this region. This region, the Research Triangle region, is one of the strongest science, technology, and innovation hubs in the world. But it's only one little region within North Carolina. And so if you go back to the 1950s in North Carolina, even if you had been here in Raleigh or Chapel Hill or Durham, which were decent-sized cities then, they were not the most prosperous cities in the country by any means. In fact, North Carolina's economy overall was very heavily focused on agriculture. And so a lot of tobacco and cotton, and this is partly the history of NC State too, a lot of work in furniture and a lot in textiles. And most of those jobs were low-wage jobs. And North Carolina was 49th in per capita income in the U.S. I don't know which state was 50th, but I'm sure it was one of the southern states. It was, the South was, an agricultural area that was relatively poor. And so there was a lot of brain drain. What we did have in North Carolina was good universities. NC State and UNC Chapel Hill and Duke and Wake Forest and a lot of the other universities were good even back then. So we, for reasons I need to research, but we have always been strong in universities. But what happened was we would have a lot of well-educated graduates, and they would look around and say, well, what kind of job am I going to get here that pays enough to earn a living wage and uses the training that I have? And so many of them would move out of state. They would go to Boston or California or other places where they could use their degrees. So we had a lot of brain drain, and political leaders and university leaders said, you know what, we need to diversify our economy. Textiles are going away, agriculture is changing, we need to move into the 21st century. And so, and that actually is an actual postcard from back then. So you can see what they highlighted: tobacco and logging, a little bit of golf, peanuts, that was what they were advertising. And that's a tobacco auction. So in the late 1950s, that's when the Research Triangle Park was started. And I'm not going to talk about that today, but that could be a whole other talk. But the initiation of the Research Triangle Park was the single event that transformed this region and made it really, to a large extent, what it is today. Had the Research Triangle Park not been formed, this would still be a strong region, but the Research Triangle Park was the catalyst that pulled together the universities and caused the universities and government and business to come together in a concerted fashion to be a leader. But so I won't talk about that. But what happened about the same time was in 1963, this board, the Board of Science, Technology, and Innovation, or the BSTI, was started by the state government. Now back then it was not called Board of Science, Technology, and Innovation. It was called the Board of Science and Technology. And it was called that from 1963 up until 2014. But in 2014, they added the word, the legislature by law added the word innovation because we asked them to. And because we had been using the word innovation in the work that we do for a long time, but it was not formally in our name, and we made a request and they actually said, okay, that's a pretty good request and it doesn't cost any money either, and so we'll hereby add the word innovation to your name, and they did. At the time, they also added more board members too, which is good and bad. It went from 19 members to 25, and so that's more bosses and more people to manage in the process. And so back in the 1950s, at the national level, there was a growing interest and recognition of the importance of science for the economy and the military and just national prestige. The space race, all that kind of stuff was going on. And so when the board was started in 1963, it kind of came on the heels of all that. And the states often follow what's going on at the federal level. Sometimes the states lead and then the feds follow. But these are the types of things that the board does, and Anna already talked about some of this. But if there's a statute that's really short, sets up the board, it says the Board of Science and Technology, hereby exists, and it has these powers and duties. And if you read them, basically anything under the sun that relates to science, technology, and innovation and how they intersect with the economy is kind of within the purview of the board. And it's really an advisory board. It doesn't have the power to make law, but it does have the power to do studies, to distribute state money, to catalyze activities, things like that. You'll see that in just a minute. And so here's the structure. There are 25 members. This is laid out in statute. The governor's a member, Secretary of Commerce, who's my boss. Then the governor appoints most of the members. As you can see, NC State has a designated seat on this board. That seat is vacant right now. That seat was filled by Alan Rebar, who used to be the chief research officer, but he retired. And we're in the process of filling that seat right now. And it's usually someone kind of in the chief research officer role. But the big three universities have seats on there: Duke, UNC Chapel Hill, and NC State. But two other UNC institutions have a seat. One has to be a historically black college and university. Also another private university. Typically that's Wake Forest. Sometimes others. Community college, K through 12 education. Then there are private sector people as well as at-large members. So all of these people are volunteers. They all have day jobs. And so they come together quarterly, and we usually meet at the Department of Commerce or someplace like that, and they oversee the work that the staff are doing. And so the staff are the actual people who get paid to do this on a daily basis. And also, the General Assembly appoints 2 members as well. So I'm the executive director. I'm technically an employee of the Department of Commerce. We have an assistant director. I just got promoted to be the deputy director, so I need to change that. We have an executive assistant. We almost always have 2 or 3 research associates, sometimes graduate students, sometimes undergraduate students, sometimes postdocs. We can't pay them because we don't have enough money. We barely can pay ourselves. But most people are willing to exchange their time in order to get some experience and also hopefully good information on their CVs and recommendations from us. And so if you're interested in that, let me know and we might have something. It all just depends on what our needs are. But then we're actually a lot bigger than 3 official employees, because since we sit in the Department of Commerce, we can use a lot of our colleagues too. So to the extent that we have legal needs, we can use the legal division, and communications needs, we can use the communication staff and the graphics division. All that's free of charge. They're not officially part of the Office of Science, Technology, and Innovation. They're part of the Department of Commerce. So we're actually a lot bigger than we sound. And so what are the types of things that the board does? Any questions at this point? The state in this region, and we try to pick members that are diverse across the state, not just all from RTP. Inevitably more come from this region just because this is the kind of nexus of all this activity. And if we meet here in Raleigh, it's harder for people in Charlotte or Asheville to come, although we do move around every once in a while. But it's usually the big ones like biotech, life sciences, IT, things like that. And these people are usually selected not for political reasons, usually for substantive reasons. And so every once in a while someone gets on there who may not know a lot, but may have connections with the legislature, or the government, or something like that. So it's typically the big industries. So here's our mission. That's the mission of the Department of Commerce, everything that's not bold. Our special addition to that is we achieve that mission, our office does, by helping to advance science, technology, and innovation. And here's some ways we do that. You can divide the type of work that we do into two broad categories. The first category is strategic. That's about half of the work that we do. And 30% of the total work we do is we serve as an evaluator and an advisor. And we do, like I said earlier, we create innovation indexes to essentially assess the state of what are we strong in, what are we not so strong in, and how could we do better. And I'll show you some examples in a minute. We also are a champion and a communicator. Typically that takes the form of doing technology roadmaps, and I'll show you some of those in a minute. Policymakers are not subject matter experts typically, no matter what the subject. They are generally, they're policy makers, but that doesn't mean that they know they're experts on the subjects on which they're making policy. They usually are calling on other people, either interest groups, which are legitimate, or scientists or their constituents, and they are responding to what information they give them. And there are probably more than 100 advisory boards and commissions in the state that do the similar function to what we do. So ours is science and technology, but they're on just about every issue you could think of: crime control, healthcare. So it's experts from across the state that help advise policymakers. So one of the things we do is if there's an emerging technology that we know is going to be important for the state, like nanotechnology or data science, that policymakers know something about but not a lot, and they need to know more about it, we'll often do the homework on that and then inform them. Then the other half of what we do is much more tactical, and so we are a funder and an implementer. And typically that's through running grant programs. And Sean Akins, is it Akins or Eakins? Eakins, sitting right up here. I just met him in person, but we have corresponded multiple times by email and probably by phone, because he runs a small business, Collaborations Pharmaceuticals, that got one of our grants. And so I'll tell you about that in just a minute, what that program is. We're often a convener and a facilitator. Sometimes we lead conferences. We try to pull people together that need to come together but may not come together on their own. So we're a matchmaker. We're also a recruiter and a retainer. We don't do much recruiting of companies, but the Department of Commerce does, and to the extent that they're recruiting some sort of company that's technology oriented, they'll often pull us in to hopefully speak their language a little better. And so most of what we do can be fit into those categories. A lot of it is a lot like academic work, doing reports, writing analyses, but also running grant programs and then everything in between. Okay, so the one word that I haven't defined yet is innovation. And that's the word that we added a few years ago. And back in the 1950s, they didn't use the word innovation a lot. It existed, but it wasn't as commonly used as it is now. But the reason we use it so much now is because innovation, just simply defined at the most basic level, is just something new that adds value. So it's not necessarily technology oriented. When people think of innovation, they often think of technology, but not always technology related. In an economic sense, it's the creation and adoption of new products, new services, and business models that add value. So it's not just creating a new thing, it can be a new way of doing something or a new way of providing a service. All that's new and innovative. It typically comes from science and technology, and the practical or creative application of technology. Sometimes people in the arts say, well, you're leaving us out, but arts are really important because a lot of creativity and art is very innovative. And Apple, for example, is a company that probably wouldn't be Apple were it not for a lot of the artistic influences that went into it. And innovation is really important because economists, they often don't agree on much, but one thing they do agree on is that one third to one half of economic growth in the long term is due to innovation, new products and services. Half the stuff in this room over there, for example, didn't exist 30 years ago, you know, and there's so much technology now. This remote that I'm using, this cup that it'll keep my water, you know, ice in there for more than 24 hours. All that's new, and it's due to technology and science. And those things keep coming out and keep growing the economy. It has a big multiplier effect, not just across high-tech sectors, but across lower-tech sectors too, because jobs in the innovation sector tend to pay higher wages, they tend to grow faster, and they tend to be in sectors that are called traded sectors, which means they don't just serve the local economy, they're traded outside of the region and even internationally. And so they bring outside money in. And innovation happens naturally, but it happens a lot more efficiently and a lot more effectively when you have a vibrant, healthy innovation ecosystem. Okay, I better speed up. Okay, so it's an innovation ecosystem. What we're trying to do is take these innovative ideas, hopefully create new products and practices, creates new organizations or enhances existing ones, and all to improve economic well-being and quality of life. But that's not always a linear process, not always a quick and easy process. A lot of things have to happen in between. You got to have the right research and development that takes place. That requires funding and policies and facilities and equipment. So when I was at UNC General Administration, a lot of what I did was this sort of stuff in the university setting. But you also have to have the right commercialization resources. Sean was just talking about, his company is located in the incubator here at NC State. And that's been a game changer for him because it puts him in an ecosystem that allows him to be around other people and resources and funding that can help him. He's not just in his garage working on his innovation. He's actually in an ecosystem. And these resources are relatively new in most states, in the last couple of decades maybe. And you also have to have the right education and workforce, and overarching all that, you have to have a supportive environment and infrastructure. Broadband access for the rural areas especially, support for education, and all this goes into the mix. And this is a dynamic system. Here comes another graphic that moves. So this is reality, because these things are not static. And this can be a whole state, or it can be a region within a state. And in terms of an ecosystem, an innovation ecosystem, the biggest, strongest, fastest, most vibrant one in North Carolina is in this region that we're in, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, and the surrounding areas. Most regions of the state aren't that way. They're either missing some pieces, or to the extent that all the pieces are there, they're not moving as fast and pumping as fast. And so one of the things that my office does is tries to make sure that we have more of these across the state and more vibrant ones across the state. Okay, so that's why we do this tracking innovation report. I'm going to speed through this. Basically, let me see. Here's the punchline. Our innovation ecosystem as a state, statewide, is moderately healthy. We rank essentially 21st among the 50 states. And that surprises people. They're like, 21st? No way. You can't be right. You used the wrong data, something like that. This is for the state. This is not for RTP. If we measured only RTP, we'd be like top 5 and everything, if not more. But when you average everything out, we have 40 different indicators in this, whether it's R&D or commercialism, everything in that ecosystem, we rank 21st. But we're coming up. We're improving, actually. We've improved since the early 2000s when we started measuring, but we're not quite improving as fast as the US overall. That's a little misleading because this is an average, and averages tend to be skewed by outliers, and outliers like California and Massachusetts tend to skew things up. We also have our ranking, and we are almost always above the median when it comes to the ranking. And so our ranking tends to be higher than our average score. But what we see is that, yes, we're improving, but to the extent that we're improving, it tends to be very much so, really, disproportionately larger in counties with high population and or research universities. So the big and the strong are getting bigger and stronger, and the weak and not as strong are not doing as well. And so here's one way to show that. This is new for the index. This is the first time we've done this. There are 6 counties that represent, in North Carolina, that represent 6% of the land area. There are a total of 100 counties, which makes the math really easy. So I always like that. So those 6 counties are Mecklenburg, which is where Charlotte is, Wake, where we are, Guilford, Greensboro, Forsyth, Winston-Salem, Durham, and Orange. Okay, so those 6 counties account for 34% of the state's population, 50% of the population growth since 2018. They represent a bigger share overall, on average, of the economy, whether it's total income, companies, jobs, or gross domestic product. But where they really have a disproportionate influence is in things that relate to the innovation economy. So things like the college educated population, or college educated in-migrants. 57% of college educated in-migrants, people coming into the state, are coming to those 6 counties. So 6% of the state is accounting for 57% of the college educated in-migrants. This is high science, engineering, and technology companies. 79% of the patents, 79% of the high-tech companies. Those are the types of grants that Sean's company got, SBIR grants. Those are federal grants that we match at the state. 94% of the venture capital and 98% of university R&D. Highly concentrated. However, that is not unusual among all the other states as well. When people think of Massachusetts, man, Massachusetts is such a leader. It's not so much Massachusetts as it is Boston. And California is such a leader. It's really Silicon Valley, LA, San Diego. If you take those cities out, California would not be a leader. And so it's almost always concentrated. So another thing is when we've been doing this index, we're doing the 2019 one right now. It's going to be coming out later this year. There's not much left of the year, is there? We have like 2 weeks to finish it. But we're almost there. We're almost there. I was working on it today. It's always a race to the finish. Okay. We've been doing it for a while, and people say, okay, you got 40 indicators in there, but which ones really matter? That what it really boiled down to was educational attainment, how well educated overall is your population, and this is basically if you're above average, you have above average economic outcomes. How much of your economy is in science and engineering occupations? If you're above average, you tend to have above average outcomes. And how much of your industries are in science and engineering? Okay, and so then we said, okay, that's an important finding. Now, how does North Carolina do in those? What we find is that typically, well, here's the population of North Carolina. That's where we are. But as you can see, it's highly concentrated in this crescent. There are typically universities there. And that's where a lot of the activity is there in Charlotte and in between, with some in the Asheville area and some in the Wilmington area. That's just to get your bearings. So, okay. So, if you look at those 3 economic well-being indicators, what you can see is, the color's kind of hard to see, but we don't have GDP data at the county level, but we do have it at the metropolitan statistical area level, which is an aggregation of counties. There are only 2 MSAs here where we are. No, actually, Raleigh is equal with the U.S. average. It's only the Durham MSA and the Charlotte MSA that are above the U.S. average. All the other MSAs in the state are below the U.S. average when it comes to GDP. And so, again, highly concentrated activity. Same thing with median household income. Only these ones in blue are above the U.S. average. A tiny minority of the counties in North Carolina. Then when you look at wages, there's only 3 counties in North Carolina that are above the U.S. average when it comes to wages. And so when you hear about the rural-urban divide, not just in North Carolina, but nationally, these types of patterns are driving it. And it's not as though somebody is forcing these things to happen. A lot of these are due to natural forces. These are market forces at work. And they, especially they've gotten worse over time as the economy's become more knowledge-based, because younger people, more educated people, want to be in industries that are high-tech. Those tend to be in urban areas, and it creates this cycle that's reinforcing, so that more and more people leave the rural areas and come to the urban areas. So public policy does have a role to try to counteract that. So let's skip through those. Basically, the rest of these maps show you that to the extent that those outcome measures are highly concentrated, the input measures are also highly concentrated. So you've got a system that's kind of self-reinforcing and explains why North Carolina ranks 21st as opposed to top 5. And this index goes into a lot of detail. It's like 112 pages long, and so it's very long, but it's easy to read. I promise it. It says, what's this indicator? How's North Carolina doing? And what does this mean for North Carolina? So you can skim it, get what you want pretty quickly. So the key messages are basically we need to increase those things if we want to increase output. Let me go on real quickly. We're getting close, trust me. So, okay. So historically, what has my board done since 1963? A lot of people have never heard of the Board of Science, Technology, and Innovation. But when I give talks like this, I'll say, okay, how many of you have heard of this board? And maybe a few hands go up. And I'll say, okay, now keep your hand up or raise your hand if you've heard of any of these things. The School of Science and Math, or the North Carolina Biotech Center, or the First Flight Venture Center in RTP or MCNC. And a lot of people have heard of those things. And then I'll say, well, have you heard of the 1NC Small Business Program or North Carolina's Nanotechnology Roadmap? And by the time I ask all those questions, everyone's hand is up. And that's because this board has done a lot of stuff, but it's not about claiming credit. It usually comes up with an idea, hands it off to politicians, and they're the ones that take credit, because they're the ones that have to get reelected. And so I have to keep my job too, but I don't get elected by the electorate. So these are core institutions in North Carolina's innovation and science and technology innovation ecosystem that might not be in place were it not for this board. And those were done in the 1980s. In the 1990s, that's when the internet was taken off. They helped build the information highway. Universal service was another thing related to the internet. They also were involved in science and math education, and they did a lot of strategic planning. In the 2000s, we did a roadmap on nanotechnology that led to a lot of good things. For time reasons, I can't go through all that. Here's all those innovation indexes, and here's 2 grant programs that we've run. The 1NC Small Business Program that Sean has benefited from, and then the North Carolina Green Business Fund. We also do reports. This is a report on energy. This is on how do you help rural areas get involved in the innovation economy. This is about the data economy. This is about clean energy and clean transportation, what kind of workforce is needed for those. These are more innovation indexes. These are working groups that we did reports for the governor's office, all on university commercialization. And so all of these things go into the ecosystem and help make it stronger. And my board's been involved in those, and I've been involved in those as a staff member. Now, the challenge is that often there's a big gap between science and technology. It's one thing to draw a diagram, it's another thing to actually put something into practice. And so, and I promise I'll be done soon. So, to help put things into practice, we have run these grant programs. The blue dots, and there are probably almost 400 blue dots up there. You can't tell that, but 400 blue dots and like 80 or 90 green dots. Those are all the grants that our office has given out since 2006. It's added up 558 grants, total of $36 million that our office has given out, mainly to small businesses throughout the state. 68 North Carolina cities and 43 North Carolina counties. That's pretty diverse, but as you can see, there's a lot of parts of the state that don't have grants. But a lot of that is due to the fact that they just don't have much population there, and there aren't as many businesses there as well. Oh, actually, those numbers are there, sorry. So that's a lot of what we've done. Probably 40% of my time day in and day out is spent on these grant programs. And the one I'm going to talk about is something called the SBIR program, which is a federal grant program. And the reason I'm going to talk about it is because it's a great federal program, but it's often not good enough to get companies where they need to go. And so several states like North Carolina have created matching programs to help companies. So in the 1970s, we were really worried about other countries kind of eating our lunch when it came to technology and science and the economy. People said R&D is really important and innovation is really important, and those small businesses can help a lot, but they often lack resources. So the federal government created something called the Small Business Innovation Research Program, where they took a portion of the money that would otherwise go to universities for research, and they give it directly to companies to do development work. It's research work too, but more development work. And this was Ronald Reagan actually helped sign the program into law. This is the signing ceremony where he did. And what it does is it's a set aside of federal R&D money that goes from 11 different agencies like DOD and NSF and NIH and all those, goes not to universities but goes to companies and helps those companies create new products and hopefully take them to the marketplace. And you can see a lot of money has been awarded through those, $160,000 awards over time, created a lot of economic outputs and a lot of follow-on investments. Great federal program. Those are the agencies, but I'm going to skip that too. Great federal program, but often it's not enough money. Who knows how many great inventions never made it to be the real thing because they ran out of money. And apparently this happened with the wheel way back, billions of years ago. They tried some prototypes, but those didn't work. This is just a coincidence that a cartoonist has my name. I do that. So anyway, so we recognize that. Federal money's great, but sometimes it's not enough to get your prototype created and get it to the marketplace. And even if it is enough, often there are restrictions on the federal money. Like the federal money can't be used for patents. As far as I remember, it can't be used for consultants or things like that. And so those are important things if you're a small business and want to create a new product. You got to secure your intellectual property. And so, or you just got to pay your staff. And so some states, and we did this back in 2003 when we did that tracking innovation report. One of the things we measured was, how's North Carolina doing on SBIR money? And we saw that we were doing pretty well on the first phase of SBIR money, which is the proof of concept money, but not as well on the phase 2 money, which is a lot more money, but you have to do well on phase 1 to get the phase 2 money. And so we looked around and we said, hey, there's some other states that actually are putting some state money in to help those companies improve their phase 1 product and have a higher probability of getting phase 2 funding. And so we essentially, we did our own R&D, which is called rip off and duplicate. And I learned that at a conference recently. That's what a lot of states do, is they just copy their other state programs. And so we looked around at all the other states, and there were maybe 5 or 6 at the time that had these programs, and took the best of theirs and created our own program. So we worked with our legislature to create this program, and once they created it in 2006, we have been going back every year to try to get funding for that program. And Sean's company is one of those companies that's gotten one of this. We essentially match the federal money. And to wrap this up, basically what you can see is I've got 6 more slides that talk about how great this program is, essentially. What are the impacts? Because people say, okay, you've given out $26 million in this program, what are we getting for it? That's what politicians want to know. We can say, well, look at all these types of companies that are getting these grants. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of quotes like this from companies that say, this is the greatest thing in the world. It's really helped us much more than anybody else has helped us. And the administrative burden was relatively low too. You can see how they use the money, paying people, buying equipment, supplies. I mean, this is like the stuff you do on your grants when you're working for R&D grants, much the similar for companies as well. You can see how many jobs have been created over time. This is since 2006 with the the state money. This is only the state money. We ask them in a way that they try to isolate jobs that were created with the state money and not the federal money. And they've also retained a lot of jobs. So they've almost, by now it's over 1,000, but because these are old data. But that's almost 1,000 jobs in the state that were created or retained by this grant funding. And the grant funding is not just used for jobs, it's used for a lot of other things as well. And so it's also helped these companies get a lot more additional funding. So we've put in $26 million, but these companies have gotten on the back end from other sources, all these other sources, more than $500 million. Now the natural question is, well, surely not all that $500 million was due to the state money. And yes, that is true. And there's no 100% perfect way to measure, well, how much of that came from the state money or was due to the state money. But what we ask all the people is we say, okay, given that money that you said you just got from those other sources, to what extent did the state matching grant help you receive that money? And as you can see, a large percentage of people strongly agree or moderately agree that the state money played a significant role. $1 million last year, why do we need to give you $1 million this year? We take these types of data to them, and usually it's pretty compelling. This year, we're in the budget for $1 million, but the legislature and the governor are at a stalemate on the budget. And they're 6 months into the fiscal year with no budget. And so people like me who get a regular recurring salary, that's safe. But for non-recurring funds like grant funds, if they don't pass a budget, that money's not there. And so this may be the first time in history that they don't ultimately pass a budget for a fiscal year. And so that's $1 million that may not go out to companies. And so it also helps create a lot of collaborations with universities. So even though the money goes directly to the companies, often the companies turn around and collaborate with universities because they're doing scientific R&D, and often the universities have the personnel and the equipment to do what needs to be done. So it helps create collaborations, it helps generate more follow-on funding, helps generate more intellectual property, helps companies stay in the state, all kinds of great stuff, which hopefully grows the innovation economy. And we try to do that. You know, any company in the state can get it. And my last comment will be that some of the times when funding is tight, we can't fund everyone. And so what we've done in the last couple of years is we've given priority to companies that are in those regions that are not prospering. And so they get to be at the front of the line when it comes to requesting state money. And if we run out of money, it's typically the companies in the prosperous regions that don't get it. Now that doesn't make them happy, but ultimately this is good for economic development because we're trying to help regions that need help. And it helps us politically, I mean, to be honest, because a lot of the political power in the legislature is from rural areas. And if all your money's going to the urban areas, they're not going to want to fund you in the long term. And so we have to do what we can to make sure that money goes not just to RTP, but to other places. And so that is my 40 slides. I'm a little over. I rushed a few things, but that's in a nutshell science and technology and kind of what my office has been doing for the last 60 years. So. I've not been there for 60 years. I've been there for 17.
I think we have about 10 minutes for questions.
So you kind of touched on it at the very end, but you described these innovation centers as innovation ecosystems.
Yeah.
So I was curious about what sort of structures are in place to, and you touched on it at the end, to make sure the money goes to the lesser funded or lesser active areas.
Yeah, so our board, by statute, has well, I'll tell you my grant program and then other things too. In our grant program, our board, by statute, has the authority to set guidelines for the program as far as how it's run. And every year we issue a solicitation and they make decisions. Okay, we really could use $5 million, but we only got $1 million. How are we going to prioritize that? Are we going to lower the amount so that everybody gets something, but it's only $10,000? Or are we going to keep the amounts higher and give it only to 20 companies as opposed to 60? And the last few years, they have said we're going to do the latter. We're going to give out fewer grants, but more money, and we're going to prioritize the areas that are really in a challenged situation. And so that's one way that we do it. there aren't a lot of programs, other programs that in the science and technology and innovation realm that target the rural areas. The one program that we tried to get funded for the last 2 years, we couldn't get funded, not because the legislators don't want it, but just because it's hard to start a new program. It was something called Innovate and See, which was going to provide grants only to rural areas and help them get the technical assistance that they need to redefine their economies. And this is not for every rural area. There are some that are really challenged, and I think there's no amount of money that's going to really help them turn it around. But there are plenty of kind of mid-tier areas that have a lot of assets, but they need to catalyze those assets and figure out what's their competitive advantage in the new economy. It might have been textiles 50 years ago, but it could be something different now. Like Wilmington is putting a lot of money into marine biotechnology, which makes a lot of sense for them. But they need more money than what they have, and they need more technical assistance than what they have right there in that area. And so this grant program was going to set up a competitive process where these underserved regions would apply to us and say, here's what we need to do, and here's how much money we need to do that, and on a competitive basis we would award those grants. So we still are going to work on that. One other thing I could say is in terms of economic development, there are two, when you hear about economic development, often what you probably hear about in the news is so-and-so big company moved from this state to North Carolina, or is expanding from that state to North Carolina, and they're going to bring 200 jobs, or they're going to create 200 jobs or something like that. And some of the times companies do that on their own, but often they do it, not always, but often they do it because they got some sort of incentive package from the state. And the Department of Commerce runs those, and one of them is called the Job Development Investment Grant, JDIG. And it's not that the state doesn't just give them a bunch of cash. Basically, for every job they create, they get a tax credit. And so it's not money, cash going to them. So it's actually a smart program to do it that way. And the 1C program is somewhat that way as well. Not the 1C Small Business, but the 1C program, which is the big brother to our program. And the reason I mention that is because the 100 counties in North Carolina are divided up into tiers. And there are 3 tiers. There are the top 20 are called Tier 3. Those are the most prosperous. The second 40 are Tier 2. They're the second least prosperous. And then there's the bottom 40. And most of those incentive programs give more tax breaks to if a company locates in a Tier 1 and Tier 2 county than a Tier 3 county. Now, what's interesting is the tax benefits are much more generous, but more often than not, companies will locate in the Tier 3 counties, the prosperous counties. And that's the challenge, is because businesses are making economic decisions. And ultimately, the incentive's going to make a difference, but only at the margin. What matters most is who has the workforce, who has the infrastructure, where do I want to live if I'm the CEO? And so those decisions are usually the first decisions that they make, and the incentives make a difference at the margin. And so it is a little like trying to get water to go uphill. I mean, it's tough, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but we should do it in hopefully a smart way and a targeted way. So, yeah. Other questions? Yes?
For those of us, especially who might be PhDs,
yes.
I mean, there's only so many places in the universe you can go with a PhD. How can we play a role in that dynamic?
Yeah, so they likely are not going to come to you, the politicians. And it's not because they don't like you, it's just because they don't need to come to you. They got all kinds of people coming to them, and you have to kind of fight your way to go see them. If you ask for a meeting, they most likely will see you. But you don't want to just call them up on the phone or send them an email and say, hey, I've got some expertise, I'd like to come talk to you. You have to, because they're busy, you have to find something that they're already interested in, but that also relates to something that you do, so that you can kind of tag on to an interest that they already have but add your own special element to it. They're not likely to get interested in something that they're not already interested in unless it's something catastrophic or really critical to their constituency. So what's your field, for example?
Computer science.
Computer science. So you have to do a little bit of creative thinking, but you have to identify first. I mean, it takes work. You have to figure out, well, what do I want? How can I help? What legislators, if there are 170 state legislators in North Carolina, which of those 170 do I want to talk to? And what do I want to say? And so the first thing they're going to say is, why do you want to meet with me, and what can I do to help? And unless you can answer those questions, then it's going to be a meeting, but it's not going to lead to anything. And so this may not be the best answer, but there is a role for well-informed, well-educated people to provide input to policymakers. But you have to do it the right way and at the right time. And that's actually a whole other presentation. I've got a presentation on that too if you want that. But it also helps to work with others. It's hard to do it by yourself. And so NC State has a state government relations group and a federal government relations group, and working with them also. You can just go meet with them and say, hey, this is my field and I'd like to contribute. And they might say, oh, I was just talking with legislator so-and-so or the governor's staff, and they were really interested about this. You ought to go talk to them. And so doing that is a good answer. Does that help at all? Is that kind of, yeah, that's a hard one to answer. Yeah. It's not easy. And politicians are often intimidated by scientists because most politicians are not scientists themselves and live in a different world, and so they don't often know how to talk to scientists, and sometimes feel outgunned intellectually and educationally. That's not a put down for politicians. It's just they're generalists, not specialists. Other questions? Yes.
What's like the hardest and most frustrating thing about your job?
Yeah, probably the hardest, most frustrating thing is being heard, and that may run counter to what I just said, and that is, it's not hard for me to give out grant money. It's not hard for me to do a report. What's hard for me is to get the ongoing resources that my office needs to do its job. And that's working with the legislature. And so you might say, well, gosh, my office is literally located right next door to the legislature, and I know a lot of the staff and the legislators, but I'm not allowed to go to initiate a phone call or an email to a legislator because I have to go through the chain of command. And if I do that and the Secretary of Commerce, my boss finds out, and he'll say, well, why was John Hardin contacting so-and-so legislator to ask for money? He's got to come through me. And so I have to be a team player, and I have to work within the Department of Commerce, and we have a legislative liaison there, and that person advocates for us, but they're advocating for us and 20 other things. And so getting heard and making the case in a way that's convincing to legislators is a constant challenge. And what's so tough for our office is so much of what we do is longer term. The benefits are longer term than shorter term. R&D doesn't lead to a company like that, and jobs and products. It often takes years, especially if you're in the biomedical field. It takes sometimes 10 years or 15 years. And two, a lot of the work we do tends to naturally gravitate towards urban areas. And a majority of the legislature is not in urban areas. So because they're short-term focused, they're making that case. Yes?
One more question.
Oh, sorry.
If I remember correctly, the success rate for federal grants is around 20 to 30%.
It's actually, for phase one, it's actually lower than that. It's like the SBIR grants is like 15% or something like that. But phase two, it's higher.
And what about for North Carolina?
For us, if we have, like in one year we had $5 million, the success rate was essentially 100% because we had enough money to fund everyone at a pretty generous amount. When we have $1 million, the success rate is maybe 30% or 40%, but that's only due to funding limitations. Because if you qualify for a federal grant, you automatically qualify for the state grant, assuming that you get your federal grant at the right time and you literally are located, your primary place of business is in North Carolina. So it's almost a formulaic. You qualify if you meet the criteria. Every once in a while we reject someone because they're not the right time, or they are in another state trying to weasel into North Carolina's money.
We can do one more.
Yes.
As less directly related to your job, but so as a California native, hearing comparisons being drawn to California's growth, technology, and innovation,
Yeah.
like where, in terms of trying to mold our, like, and North Carolina's growth in the same sectors to follow their policy, what do you see that we're trying to learn from them and that we defer from them, or that we don't want to repeat from them, I guess?
Well, California is an interesting case. I mean, most states are an interesting case, but they're all a little unique. Most of California's success was not due to a state board or directed state policy like mine. A lot of it was due to strong academic institutions that also got federal contracts, which then built up industries, which then helped generate Silicon Valley and things like that. So it was kind of organically, but also with a heavy dose of federal money, decades ago. And so people often look to Silicon Valley as the model, but I would not want to create another Silicon Valley here in RTP. Because they have lots of equity issues and traffic issues and cost of living issues. And I mean, I've been to Silicon Valley plenty of times, and I would much rather be here. I'm actually worried about North Carolina if it gets this region getting too successful, having too much sprawl and too much inequity and not enough diversity and things like that. And so the challenge, I think, is how do you have an economy rooted in a strong innovation ecosystem, but also have those benefit not only those at the top, but a broader cross-section. And I don't know the answer to that as far as how to do it. It's tough. But, I mean, we often look to Silicon Valley, but mainly because it's one of the few places that's really got a super strong, thriving innovation ecosystem. But people around the world come look at RTP as well. I mean, I meet with international delegations from all over the world that they know more about RTP than they know about North Carolina. In fact, they'll say, is North Carolina in RTP? they know RTP, but they don't know North Carolina. And so it's easy to take it for granted when you live here, but this is one of the top innovation ecosystems in the country and in the world.
I'd just like to thank Dr. Hardin for coming and for all of you for attending. Just to give you a little more information, so my name's Anna Dye, and along with Ryan, we're the co-presidents of SciPol PAC, a science policy professional development club for graduate students, postdocs, and early career scientists at NC State. If you could sign up in the back, and if you want to put your email on that form, we can then contact you about future meetings and make more events like this happen. So thank you, Dr. Hardin.